Under the dim light of the small hut, the girl moved quietly, her eyes fixed on the worn mat that served as her nightly resting place. Every evening, as the shadows stretched long across the room, a familiar dread settled in her chest, heavier than the wooden beams that supported the roof. Her stepfather's arrival was heralded not by words of comfort or guidance but by the harsh, relentless echoes of cruelty. Each night, without fail, he would approach her meal with a smirk on his face, an expression that had long since become synonymous with malice. Before she could even bow her head to show deference, he would spit into her food, a gesture both degrading and deliberate, designed to remind her of her place in his household. The girl had learned to watch for it, to brace herself, yet no amount of preparation could dull the sting that followed the first bitter taste. The smell of the once warm stew, now tainted by his deliberate disdain, clung to her nose and made her stomach twist. She forced herself to swallow, chewing slowly as if the act of eating itself could shield her from the humiliation. Around her, the hut was small and suffocating. Worn wooden furniture, patched walls, and a fireplace that emitted more smoke than warmth mirrored the atmosphere of the household. Cold, oppressive, and uninviting. Even the small window, through which she could glimpse the village beyond, seemed to serve only as a reminder of the freedom she was denied. Outside, the world moved in rhythms of laughter, labor, and joy, yet she was trapped in a perpetual night of disgrace. Her stepfather did not stop at food. His cruelty extended to words sharpened like knives, slicing her self-esteem in precise increments. He mocked her appearance, noting every smudge, torn hem, or stray hair as evidence of her supposed inadequacy. The girl had grown accustomed to these insults, learning to endure them silently. Each comment was a reminder that her existence in his eyes was nothing more than an object of amusement and derision. He would often call out her failures in front of any visitor or member of the household, ensuring that the humiliation became communal, an unspoken contract of shame that all were expected to witness without intervening. Even within the walls of her small room, the girl felt no sanctuary. Her stepfather's eyes seemed to follow her constantly, always calculating, always judging. She learned to move with quiet precision, to bend and step as if her very breath could betray her. Nights were the hardest, for in the silence she felt the weight of isolation more keenly. She would lie awake on the thin mat, listening to the creaks of the house settling, wondering why such cruelty existed in the world she inhabited. Each spitting, each mocking word, became a ritualized torment, embedding itself in her memory, shaping the contours of her internal world. Yet within this dark landscape, there was a strange kind of observation. The girl became acutely aware of the rhythms and habits of her stepfather. She noticed the way he favored certain gestures, how his arrogance made him predictable in small ways, and how his confidence could blind him to subtle signals around him. These observations were silent seeds of resilience, tiny threads that would later weave into her understanding of the power dynamics in her household. Even as her body endured the indignities of each evening, her mind remained sharp, cataloging, analyzing, and quietly planning in ways her oppressor could not perceive. The emotional toll of this nightly abuse was immense. Loneliness wrapped around her like a second skin, suffocating in its persistence. She felt the sting of injustice not only for herself but also for the unspoken truth that no one intervened, that the community, complicit through silence, allowed the cruelty to persist. Her heart learned caution, her spirit learned patience, and her eyes learned to mask the fires that simmered within. She developed a careful exterior, one that could survive the relentless scorn, while internally, a quieter, deeper force began to take root, an understanding that she must endure, observe, and eventually find a way to reclaim power in a world that sought to keep her beneath it. By the end of each night, when the stepfather finally retreated to his quarters, she would sit in the dim glow of the fading embers in the hearth, cleaning the remnants of the defiled food with trembling hands. The weight of humiliation bore down upon her, yet in these quiet moments, a sense of observation and internal fortification grew. She learned that survival demanded more than silence. It demanded attentiveness, endurance, and an unspoken strategy that would, one day, allow her to turn the cruelty upon its source. The household itself seemed to mirror the stepfather's tyranny, walls scarred by years of neglect, corners filled with shadows, and the faint scent of smoke and ashes lingering in every room. Every object and space reminded her of the limits imposed on her freedom, the careful monitoring of her every action, and the expectation that she would remain subservient and powerless. Her life had become a performance of submission, an endless series of gestures designed to avoid wrath. Yet beneath this imposed facade, the mind of the girl worked tirelessly, cataloging weaknesses, memorizing routines, and nurturing the first flickers of an inner fire that the stepfather could not yet see. Even in the quiet moments as she lay curled beneath her thin blanket, the taste of humiliation still lingered, but alongside it grew a sense of anticipation. Each act of cruelty, each mockery, each spit in her food became a marker of injustice, a tangible reminder that those who wielded power through fear and humiliation were not invincible. The girl's life under her stepfather's hidden cruelty was harsh, relentless, and shaping her in ways he could never imagine. And though her nights were filled with suffering, they also became the crucible in which her silent strength was forged, preparing her for the moment when patience, observation, and inner resolve would rise to confront the injustice that had been forced upon her. Her eyes, hardened by the endless cycle of abuse, reflected both sorrow and a burgeoning comprehension of power. She learned that cruelty often blinds those who wield it, and in this blindness lay opportunity. Each night of hidden torment was both punishment and education, a bitter teacher that cultivated resilience and insight. The household, steeped in oppressive silence and abuse, could not diminish the quiet, growing force within her, a force that waited, patient, for the moment it would be unleashed. By the first light of dawn, after enduring another night of humiliation and mockery, the girl would rise quietly, carrying the invisible weight of cruelty yet moving with a careful deliberation. Her body bore the marks of suffering, but her mind and spirit had begun to weave the threads of strategy, endurance, and resilience. The stepfather believed he had broken her, that each nightly humiliation had bent her spirit beyond repair. Yet within the hidden recesses of her heart, a fire had been kindled, one that would, in time, consume the arrogance of her oppressor and transform her silent suffering into unyielding strength. Alone in the small, dimly lit corner of the household, the girl sat with her knees drawn to her chest, trying to make herself as small as possible, as though shrinking could erase her suffering. The night had fallen, but it offered little comfort. The shadows seemed alive, echoing the laughter and insults she had endured just hours before. Her stepfather's cruelty had been relentless, each act carefully calculated to undermine her sense of self. The spit in her food, the mocking glances, the sharp words that cut through the quiet of the evening, all of it had left its mark, yet she bore it silently, refusing to grant her tormentor the satisfaction of witnessing despair. She allowed herself to cry only when she was certain no one could see. Tears slid down her cheeks in the darkness, carrying with them the weight of humiliation and fear. Yet each tear was not a surrender, rather, it was a forging of resilience. She understood that the world outside these walls would not offer her protection, and that strength had to be cultivated within, in silence. The act of crying became a ritual of endurance, a private acknowledgement of pain paired with a promise to survive. Every tear strengthened her resolve, even as it left her feeling hollow and worn. While her body endured the pangs of hunger and humiliation, her mind remained sharp. She observed everything around her with painstaking attention. The way her stepfather walked through the room, the precise flicker in his eyes when he believed he had caught her off guard, the slight hesitation in his voice when speaking to others, all of it was catalogued in her memory. She noticed the patterns, the rhythms of his arrogance, and the moments when his overconfidence left him vulnerable. These observations were her secret weapon, quietly shaping the contours of a strategy she did not yet fully understand but felt stirring within her. Her suffering was compounded by the sense of isolation. The house, though occupied, offered no comfort. Each creaking floorboard, each flicker of firelight, reminded her that she was both seen and unseen. The household was a theater of oppression. Meals defiled, chores imposed with demeaning precision, insults delivered with surgical cruelty. Yet in this theater she became a silent audience, watching and learning. She could anticipate the next act of humiliation before it came, and in that anticipation she found a subtle power. She began to understand that endurance itself could be a form of rebellion, a quiet assertion of autonomy in the face of tyranny. Even in the moments of deepest grief, she noticed small details her stepfather overlooked. The way his anger sometimes betrayed impatience, the slight tremor in his hands when he thought no one was watching, the inconsistencies in his stories, all these became data points. Each piece of information, seemingly insignificant, contributed to a growing understanding of the man who sought to crush her. Her endurance was not passive. It was active, a study in human behavior and weakness. She realized that cruelty, when wielded without awareness, could become a trap for its wielder. The girl's silent suffering also included an acute awareness of her own body. Hunger gnawed at her, but she learned to manage it with discipline, eating sparingly and conserving her energy. She endured physical discomfort as a test of will, each pang of emptiness a reminder that her survival depended on patience and mental fortitude. Her small victories, completing a day's tasks without faltering under insult, suppressing tears in public, moving through the house without drawing attention, became milestones, proof that she could withstand more than others believed possible. She spent hours contemplating her feelings, analyzing the sting of shame and the bitter taste of injustice. In solitude she transformed emotions into lessons. Fear was dissected and understood, anger was tempered into focus. The girl realized that her stepfather's power depended on her visible submission. By keeping her reactions hidden, she deprived him of the satisfaction he sought. This awareness became a quiet rebellion, a method of exerting control over the only domain she could influence, herself. Her nights were also filled with imaginative exercises, envisioning herself not as the victim but as a force to be reckoned with. In the dark, she rehearsed responses to insults, planned subtle ways to exploit weaknesses she observed, and imagined scenarios where she could turn her suffering into leverage. These exercises were mental armor, each imagined victory fortifying her spirit against the relentless assaults of the day. The girl also became attuned to the rhythm of the household, learning when to move, when to speak, and when to remain silent. She noted who among the villagers or servants might be sympathetic, who could be trusted, and who would blindly serve her stepfather's cruelty. This network of observation, though small and mostly internal, began to provide a sense of connection to the wider world she had been denied. By the time she finally laid her head down on the cold, uneven floor to rest, exhaustion weighed heavily on her body, but her mind remained alert. She reflected on each encounter, each slight, each act of scorn, and catalogued the lessons they offered. Her suffering, though intense, became a crucible, refining her patience, sharpening her understanding of power, and teaching her that endurance in silence could become a foundation for eventual triumph. In the quiet of the night, she whispered to herself, a vow more felt than spoken: she would survive. She would learn. She would rise. The girl, broken in appearance but unbowed in spirit, absorbed the cruelty around her, not as defeat but as instruction. Each act of abuse, each moment of isolation became a stepping stone, a secret education in resilience, observation, and strategic patience. By silently enduring, she transformed pain into insight, humiliation into awareness, and suffering into the quiet strength that would one day allow her to confront the injustice that had been forced upon her. Through this silent endurance, she became more than a victim. She became a repository of knowledge and patience. Her stepfather may have believed that nightly humiliation and cruel gestures had broken her, but in truth, they were forging a sharper, wiser, and more formidable presence. Every insult absorbed, every tear shed in secret, every minute spent observing and calculating contributed to the girl's growing mastery over her own fate, ensuring that when the moment came to rise, she would do so not as the powerless child they had thought, but as a force they could no longer underestimate. In the quiet hours of the night, when the house was silent except for the creak of the floorboards and the distant sighs of wind through the trees, the girl began to hear something extraordinary. At first, it was faint, a soft rustle, a whisper that seemed to come from the very walls around her. She thought it was her imagination, perhaps a trick of exhaustion and hunger pressing against her mind. But as the nights continued, the whispers became clearer, more distinct, resonating with a rhythm that spoke directly to her heart. The voice, gentle yet commanding, carried wisdom she did not yet fully understand, and with each word, a sense of possibility took root in her soul. The whispers spoke of balance, of justice that transcended human cruelty. They told her that suffering, though painful, could be transformed into strength. Each act of humiliation endured at the hands of her stepfather was not simply an injustice but a seed, planted for a time when it could bloom into power. The girl listened closely, drinking in the words like water in a desert, absorbing lessons about patience, observation, and the quiet art of preparation. She began to perceive patterns in her oppressor's behavior that previously had gone unnoticed, small cracks in his arrogance that could be exploited in the future. Sometimes the whispers came in visions. Shadows on the walls would shift into figures of guidance, elders from distant times, ancestors whose faces she had never seen yet felt intimately familiar. They moved with dignity and purpose, teaching her to sense the flow of energy, to understand cause and effect in both human behavior and the world around her. One vision showed her a future where cruelty turned upon itself, where those who believed themselves untouchable became ensnared by their own arrogance. Another depicted the stepfather, powerless before a force that had been cultivated quietly, in the silence of suffering. Each vision filled her with a mixture of awe and determination, a burning curiosity to see how these lessons might manifest in reality. The girl also began to notice subtle signs in her environment. The wind seemed to answer her moods, shifting gently when she concentrated on her inner strength. Small animals appeared in moments of quiet, almost as if offering companionship and counsel. The firelight danced in patterns that mirrored her thoughts, and she interpreted them as affirmations that the guidance she received was not simply a dream, but something more profound, a connection to forces that respected the balance between justice and cruelty. Her nights became training grounds for the mind and spirit. While her body remained confined and exhausted from her stepfather's punishments, her mind traveled through lessons whispered into her soul. She learned to focus on tiny details, the twitch of a finger, a flicker in the eyes of her oppressor, the pause before a word is spoken. These details, when understood in combination, revealed vulnerabilities. The girl realized that knowledge was a weapon, often more potent than any physical strength. Every observation, every insight gleaned from the whispers, became part of a silent arsenal she would one day wield. The whispers taught her more than strategy, they instilled a moral framework. She understood that power without purpose was hollow, and that revenge alone could not satisfy the deep justice her heart sought. Instead, the guidance emphasized balance. Cruelty met with consequence, lies revealed with clarity, and oppression countered with awareness. This wisdom gave her a sense of calm, a quiet confidence that grew night by night. The girl began to feel herself expanding beyond the limitations her stepfather had imposed, sensing a power within her that was patient, deliberate, and righteous. Sometimes the whispers took the form of dialogue, as though conversing with her directly. They asked questions that prompted reflection. Why do you endure? What is your strength? How will you act when the time comes? She answered them in her mind, and with each answer, the connection deepened. It was a learning that could not be rushed, a careful nurturing of insight that would later serve as the foundation for her triumph. In these moments she felt neither fear nor despair, only the growing awareness that her current suffering was temporary, a catalyst for something far greater. Even in the presence of her stepfather, she began to carry herself differently. Though outwardly submissive, inwardly she held a sense of authority and control, as though the whispers had infused her with a silent confidence that no scorn or ridicule could pierce. She started to predict his moods, anticipate his taunts, and endure them with a composure that surprised even herself. The whispers were like a secret language, guiding her steps and thoughts, allowing her to cultivate an inner realm of power untouched by external cruelty. The girl also started to connect the whispers to her own abilities. She noticed subtle changes in her perception, intuition, and presence. Her senses sharpened. She could detect intentions before they were spoken and understand emotions before they were expressed. Each insight from the whispers reinforced her growing realization that she was not powerless. The hardships endured had not diminished her, they had awakened latent potential, and the guidance she received now helped her shape it with purpose. By the end of many nights, the girl felt a profound shift within herself. The whispers, the visions, and the signs in the natural world had combined to create a blueprint for action. She was no longer merely surviving, she was preparing. Each piece of counsel, each ancestral lesson, each spark of intuition became a stepping stone toward the day she would confront the cruelty imposed upon her. She understood that the power whispered to her was not simply for personal vengeance, but for justice, balance, and the restoration of dignity. In this quiet, unseen, and deeply personal preparation, the girl discovered the first true measure of her strength. It was not in muscles or outward defiance, but in patience, awareness, and the subtle guidance of forces greater than herself. The whispers of justice had awakened in her a force that would one day turn the tables on her stepfather, a power built from endurance, insight, and the quiet certainty that cruelty could never endure unchecked. The girl had learned to move through her days as though she were invisible, a shadow among the living, taking in every detail without attracting notice. The stepfather, convinced of her weakness, continued his nightly abuses and daily mockery, unaware that each act he committed was being meticulously catalogued in her mind. She noted the way he spoke, the subtle cues in his posture when anger or pride surfaced, the small patterns that repeated themselves with uncanny predictability. Every word he uttered, every glance he threw, was a piece of a puzzle she had begun to assemble in secret. Her observations extended beyond mere behavior. She began to notice how the household responded to him, how neighbors reacted when he entered or left the room, and the subtle changes in the environment that accompanied his moods. A particular knock at the door, the timing of his meals, even the direction from which he approached, nothing escaped her notice. Each small detail was filed carefully in her mind, forming a mental map that would later guide her movements and decisions. She realized that understanding patterns was more powerful than confronting them blindly. Insight could accomplish in patience what force could never achieve in haste. As the nights passed, she combined her observations with the guidance she had received from the whispers and visions of ancestors. She began to see the broader picture, the vulnerabilities hidden beneath his arrogance, the overconfidence that led him to underestimate her, and the cracks in the structure of control he had built. With each realization, her confidence grew. She was no longer merely a passive victim. She was a strategist, quietly orchestrating a plan that would one day change the course of her life. Her strategy did not rely on brute force but on subtle manipulation and timing. She learned to predict the stepfather's moods, anticipate his reactions, and exploit his weaknesses in ways that required precision rather than strength. The girl started rehearsing scenarios in her mind, envisioning every step, every conversation, and every possible contingency. If he acted one way, she would respond another. If he expected compliance, she would subtly redirect events to her advantage. In this mental rehearsal, the seeds of mastery were planted, and a sense of empowerment began to bloom within her. She also observed the environment around her, learning how to use the household, the village routines, and the natural world to her advantage. She noted the timing of chores, the habits of servants, the locations of hidden corners and passageways, all of which could serve as tools in her plan. Even the smallest elements, like the placement of objects on a shelf or the direction of sunlight through a window, were incorporated into her strategy. The girl understood that preparation meant anticipating every variable, leaving nothing to chance, and converting every perceived disadvantage into a potential advantage. The stepfather's arrogance became a critical element in her calculations. Every boast, every act of mockery, reinforced her understanding of his overconfidence. She saw how he relied on intimidation, how he assumed compliance, and how he dismissed intelligence in those he considered weak. Each misstep, each casual dismissal, added fuel to her plan. She began to craft scenarios where his very assumptions would lead him into traps of his own making, all orchestrated through careful timing, observation, and psychological insight. Beyond observing the stepfather, the girl watched the villagers and family members as well. She noted alliances, loyalties, and tensions that could be leveraged. Some were naturally sympathetic, some merely indifferent, and some could be persuaded to aid her cause with the right nudge at the right moment. Understanding the human web surrounding her oppressor allowed her to envision the broader consequences of her actions. She realized that true strategy required more than one-on-one confrontation. It demanded the careful alignment of multiple forces, all directed toward a singular, transformative goal. Her inner strength, previously forged in silence and suffering, became the foundation for this strategy. She learned to manage her emotions, conceal her intentions, and move through the household with a quiet assurance. Each act of observation, each mental rehearsal, reinforced her patience and sharpened her judgment. By mastering herself, she mastered the first layer of the plan, the knowledge that no stepfather, no matter how cruel, could control the mind and will of one who had learned to anticipate and outthink him. The girl also began to integrate lessons from the whispers into her tactical thinking. The spirits had taught her patience, foresight, and balance. She realized that her plan needed to align not only with immediate opportunities but with long-term consequences. The stepfather's cruelty, the villagers' assumptions, the timing of events, all had to be considered. Every step of her strategy had to ensure that when she finally acted, it would be both decisive and irreversible. In secret, she constructed mental timelines, rehearsed confrontations, and visualized the reactions of each participant. She tested her theories against the behavior she had meticulously observed, adjusting her approach until she felt a deep, unshakable confidence in her plan. It was a map drawn entirely in the mind, a network of possibilities and contingencies that allowed her to see far ahead, anticipating obstacles and leveraging weaknesses. Through this process, the girl transformed suffering into insight, weakness into awareness, and observation into power. The spark of strategy was not a single act but a continuous refinement of knowledge, patience, and foresight. Every detail of her stepfather's habits, every subtlety of the household and village, and every whisper of guidance coalesced into a coherent plan. She understood that the day of reckoning would not come through sudden force, but through the deliberate execution of strategy, honed over countless nights of observation, reflection, and mental rehearsal. By the end of these nights, she felt ready, not merely to respond to cruelty but to transform it into justice. The spark of strategy burned brightly within her, an unquenchable fire fueled by intelligence, patience, and the awareness that power lies as much in the mind as in action. She had become a master of observation, a tactician of unparalleled subtlety, and a silent architect of the change that would soon sweep through her household. The stepfather moved through the house with the air of a man completely certain of his power, the confidence of someone who believed his cruelty was absolute and invisible. Each morning he rose, he cast his gaze over the household as though surveying conquered lands, assuming every servant, every villager, and most of all the girl, was under his complete control. His arrogance was visible in every gesture, the slight tilt of his chin, the exaggerated sweep of his hand when giving orders, and the mockery that flowed freely from his lips whenever the girl tried to speak or defend herself. He never imagined that his words, his actions, and even the very aura of his arrogance were being catalogued by the one person he considered too weak to resist. He reveled in his dominance, laughing openly when the girl trembled or faltered under his commands. Each sneer, each whispered insult, seemed to inflate his sense of superiority. The stepfather believed that he could bend reality with his will, that humiliation alone was enough to break her spirit. To him, her silent endurance was a confirmation of his power. He assumed that every moment of quiet observation was a sign of submission. He did not notice the way she watched, studied, and absorbed every detail of his behavior, turning his arrogance into a tool that would one day serve her own strategy. His overconfidence extended beyond the household into the village. Whenever he spoke to neighbors, he made sure his control over the girl was visible. He would recount tales of her failures, exaggerate her weaknesses, and highlight every moment of her inability to defend herself. Villagers, seeing only what he wanted them to see, nodded and whispered in agreement, reinforcing his belief that his cruelty was unopposed and absolute. The stepfather became intoxicated with this feedback loop. He acted cruelly, the villagers approved, and his sense of untouchable authority grew with each passing day. He underestimated the subtle signals the girl sent. He believed that silence was submission, that tears were weakness, and that her quiet observation had no weight. He ignored the careful attentiveness in her eyes, the way she memorized patterns, and the way her mind seemed to calculate probabilities and responses. To him, she was simply a fragile creature, incapable of action, and wholly dependent on his mercy or malice. He mocked her openly, believing that scorn and humiliation were sufficient weapons, unaware that these very actions were planting the seeds of her eventual power. His arrogance also blinded him to the lessons in patience and restraint. He acted impulsively when provoked, showing his anger in ways that were predictable and, to an observant mind, exploitable. Each outburst, each cruel act, provided her with insight into his temperament. He assumed that cruelty could bend reality to his favor, not realizing that those who endure with keen observation often see the cracks in the foundations of tyranny long before they erupt. The stepfather's cruelty was performative, a daily spectacle meant to impress upon the girl and others that he held ultimate control. He would force her into degrading tasks, watching her every move to ensure she faltered. He took pride in her discomfort, in the way she hesitated or feared his reaction. To him, this was proof of dominance. What he did not see was that each act of humiliation was a lesson in resilience for her, each forced task a chance to practice patience, and each moment of fear a mirror reflecting the vulnerabilities he himself carried within. He also underestimated the psychological strength of those he oppressed. While he believed that his mockery and power secured loyalty and fear, he did not notice the quiet defiance in the girl's gaze. She absorbed his every insult, every sneer, and every movement, storing them as information rather than allowing them to break her. He assumed that breaking the body was enough to break the spirit, ignoring the reality that spirit can survive even in chains and grow stronger in adversity. The stepfather's overconfidence became a trap in itself. He failed to consider the possibility that the girl could turn his own behavior against him. He never imagined that his carefully orchestrated cruelty could become a roadmap for her strategy, guiding her understanding of timing, leverage, and human weakness. He laughed freely at his perception of absolute power, not realizing that every word and action was being transformed into a blueprint for his eventual humiliation and defeat. Even within his family, the stepfather's arrogance alienated others. He spoke with condescension to those who might otherwise have offered support or intervention, dismissing any advice or caution. In doing so, he isolated himself, relying solely on his perceived omnipotence and ignoring the networks of influence and information around him. The girl, observing all of this, saw both the vulnerabilities in his character and the strategic opportunities presented by his hubris. Each overstep, each display of overconfidence, became a potential lever she could one day use to reclaim her power and assert justice. In the household, His tyranny was absolute, yet it was precisely this certainty that allowed the girl to grow. She learned that arrogance often precedes miscalculation, that overconfidence blinds the oppressor to subtle signs of change, and that power built on fear alone is brittle. By watching him daily, enduring his mockery and observing the consequences of his actions, she cultivated patience, awareness and foresight. The stepfather believed himself untouchable, yet it was this very arrogance, this unshakable certainty in his own cruelty, that laid the foundation for the girl's eventual rise. In essence, his overconfidence was the silent architect of his own undoing. Every act of mockery, every sneer, and every show of dominance unwittingly trained the girl, sharpened her mind, and prepared her for the moment when the balance of power would shift. He was blind to the quiet storm forming in his own household, unaware that his assumptions about weakness, submission, and obedience were feeding the very force that would one day dismantle his authority completely. By the time the girl was ready to act, the stepfather's arrogance had created a perfect stage for her emergence. He believed he was untouchable, yet all he had done was provide her with the knowledge, insight, and confidence necessary to overthrow the very power he assumed he wielded without challenge. Every act of cruelty, every moment of dismissive laughter, had built the framework of his eventual defeat, and it was only a matter of time before the girl, once underestimated, would rise and claim the authority he had long believed was his alone. The night stretched long and still, the village wrapped in slumber while the girl remained awake, crouched in the shadows of her small room. The air smelled faintly of smoke from the dying embers of the hearth, mingled with the subtle scent of damp earth that crept through the cracks in the floorboards. Outside, the stepfather's snores rose and fell, a rhythm of arrogance that reminded her of every cruel word and action he had inflicted. Yet instead of fear, his presence ignited a spark within her, a determination sharpened by years of humiliation and careful observation. Tonight, she would transform all that suffering into preparation, every moment of quiet endurance becoming a building block for the confrontation she knew would come. Her first task was to gather knowledge. She retrieved the small notebook she had hidden beneath her mattress, its pages filled with careful observations, sketches, and notes. Every pattern she had noticed, the stepfather's routines, the hours he left the household unsupervised, the times he allowed the servants to act with leniency, and the small contradictions in his behavior, was recorded meticulously. By light of a single candle, she reviewed each entry, connecting threads she had never fully seen before. She understood that the seemingly random cruelty was actually predictable. He thrived on ritual, on repetition, on the illusion of control. This knowledge became her first weapon, for she realized that understanding one's opponent was more powerful than any overt act of rebellion. As the candle flickered, she moved on to honing her instincts. She had spent years watching the world from the margins, quietly noting the smallest gestures of people around her, reading micro-expressions and tone, and predicting outcomes based on minimal information. Tonight, she practiced further, imagining scenarios where she would confront her stepfather. She visualized his movements, anticipated his words, and rehearsed calm but firm responses. Her hands trembled slightly not from fear but from the intensity of focus, for she knew that mental preparation would be as crucial as any physical action. The whispered lessons of patience and observation, long ignored by those who mocked her, became her guiding principles. Every sound in the house was catalogued. She heard the distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of a rat in the corner, the subtle creak of the floorboards as the stepfather turned in his sleep. She practiced moving silently, shifting her weight from foot to foot, testing her balance and agility. Though her body had been weakened over time by neglect and mockery, her mind compensated, turning every disadvantage into a tool for precise and calculated action. Each motion, each movement, was rehearsed with care, as if the shadows themselves were instructing her in the language of stealth and timing. The girl also focused on her emotional control. Years of public humiliation had taught her the volatility of unchecked emotion, the way anger could betray weakness and fear could invite dominance. Tonight, she trained herself to feel rage without showing it, to channel sorrow into determination, and to let every insult, every sneer, every moment of past humiliation fuel her resolve rather than diminish it. She breathed deeply, visualizing the confrontation, imagining the stepfather's overconfidence meeting her calm, unyielding presence. She practiced maintaining poise, speaking with authority, and letting her eyes convey strength without a single word uttered. Her preparations extended beyond the mind and spirit to subtle manipulations of her environment. She checked locks, observed the placement of objects, and noted the weak points in the stepfather's domain. Every cupboard, every door, every window became part of her mental map. She considered how she might control access, anticipate interference, and use the physical space to her advantage. Even the servants, whose allegiance she had quietly observed and tested over time, became variables in her plan, their likely actions accounted for and factored into her strategies. During moments of silence, she allowed herself to remember the whispers that had guided her, the voices of ancestors, elders, or inner intuition. These whispers were no longer mere comfort. They were strategic counsel, reminders of her growing power and of the inevitability of justice. She meditated on their lessons, letting them weave into her mind and body, sharpening reflexes, clarifying intent, and reinforcing the certainty that her actions would not be random but deliberate, precise, and effective. As the night deepened, she rehearsed the confrontation in full detail, imagining the sequence from start to finish. She visualized the stepfather's smug expressions, his mocking tone, and the exact moment when control would slip from his hands. Every phrase she intended to speak, every gesture she would make, and every reaction she anticipated from him and the villagers was played in her mind repeatedly until each movement felt instinctive. The rehearsals were exhaustive, but they were necessary. The girl understood that true power lay not in spontaneity alone but in the mastery of foresight and preparation. Her body, though weary, was trained to respond at the exact right moment. She practiced controlled breathing, focusing on balance, and maintaining composure despite the gnawing tension that hunger and fear had ingrained over the years. She recognized that the body's readiness would amplify the mind's strategy. Neither could succeed without the other. Each stretch, each silent step, each shift of weight was practiced as a prelude to the day she would reclaim her dignity and assert authority. By the final hours before dawn, the girl felt a quiet surge of confidence. The house remained still, the stepfather still gloating in his imagined triumphs, unaware that the very person he sought to humiliate was now poised with knowledge, control, and determination. Every tear shed, every insult endured, every act of cruelty witnessed had been transformed into a preparation so meticulous that nothing in the coming confrontation would be left to chance. The night itself seemed to hold its breath, as if acknowledging the quiet power that had grown in the shadows, waiting for its moment to rise. In these final moments, the girl allowed herself a brief reflection, not of fear but of anticipation. She had transformed suffering into strategy, humiliation into insight, and endurance into strength. The whispers of guidance, the lessons of observation, and the meticulous rehearsals had prepared her not just to confront her stepfather but to redefine the balance of power in the household. With the first faint light of dawn approaching, she was ready, her mind clear, her spirit unbroken, and her resolve absolute. The night of preparation had ended, and the dawn of her resurgence was inevitable. The pivotal night arrived with a tension that hung heavy in the air, pressing against the walls of the dimly lit household. The girl, who had endured years of cruelty, humiliation, and mockery, moved with the precision of someone who had spent countless hours studying the habits, weaknesses, and arrogance of her stepfather. Every sound, the creak of the floorboards, the rustle of a curtain, even the faintest breath of the wind, was catalogued and interpreted. She had planned this moment with meticulous care, knowing that brute force alone could not overturn the years of oppression. Subtlety, cunning, and her newfound abilities would be her weapons. Her stepfather, arrogant and unaware, paced the room as he always did, drinking and boasting about his control over her, his cruelty sharpened by overconfidence. He believed that she remained fragile, weak, and compliant, never suspecting that every act of mockery, every cruel gesture, had been observed, studied, and stored away like a blueprint for his eventual downfall. The girl watched from the shadows, her body still but her mind alive with strategy. Each movement he made, each smirk he offered, became another piece of the puzzle she had spent years assembling. The first act of the plan was subtle. A candle, carefully adjusted in its holder during previous nights of silent observation, wavered as he approached it, spilling a few drops of melted wax onto the table. The stepfather barely noticed, attributing it to the flickering of the flame, but the girl recognized it as a test of patience and timing. Every element in the room, every object, had been positioned with thought, primed to react to her influence. She had learned to channel her focus, to direct subtle forces through attention and intention, transforming ordinary surroundings into instruments of control. When he finally turned toward her, expecting either fear or submission, the room shifted. Chairs tilted ever so slightly, loose floorboards responded to her silent command, and the once passive household environment seemed to lean toward her will. The stepfather laughed, unaware that the laughter itself became a signal of his vulnerability. He moved closer, gloating, spitting into the air as he often did to reinforce his dominance, but the air seemed to thicken, resisting the motion in ways he could not comprehend. His arrogance blinded him to the subtle manipulations orchestrated by the girl, and each act of cruelty only strengthened her focus and control. Her plan unfolded in layers, combining observation, timing, and the mysterious power she had nurtured in silence. She had calculated the exact moment when his ego would be at its peak, when he would be most careless. At that instant, the objects he relied upon betrayed him, not violently but unmistakably. A spoon slipped from his hand, a floorboard shifted beneath him, and the candle flame, previously passive, leapt higher, illuminating the surprise on his face. Each minor mishap was carefully choreographed to build tension, to destabilize him, and to reveal that the once unassailable authority he wielded was not absolute. The stepfather's confusion grew. He looked around, shouting accusations, but no one responded. The room itself seemed to answer only the girl's will. She stepped forward quietly, letting the weight of her presence be felt before any words were spoken. Her eyes, calm yet piercing, fixed on him, and the power she had cultivated over months of hardship radiated outward. She had learned that dominance was not about force alone, but about perception, control, and timing. Each of her movements was deliberate, conveying authority that had been forged in silence, suffering, and patience. Then came the revelation of consequences. The stepfather, who had taken pleasure in humiliating her for years, now experienced the repercussions of his own cruelty. The objects he had wielded as extensions of his power, the chain of command in the household, the physical implements of his mockery, turned against him subtly but inexorably. Doors shifted, tripping him. Food spilled where it should not. Shadows seemed to loom, accentuating his fear. Each effect was designed to mirror the humiliation he had inflicted upon her, allowing him to feel, in a measured way, the weight of years spent imposing control. She did not rush to act with overt violence. Her strength lay in the orchestration of events, in the careful timing of minor accidents that revealed his vulnerability and undermined his confidence. The stepfather, now trembling, could not comprehend the source of the power he faced. Every attempt to regain composure only played into the girl's design, each gesture and word from him feeding the crescendo of her control. She had transformed the room into an arena where intellect, patience, and subtle mastery of unseen forces outmatched brute arrogance. Finally she spoke, her voice calm but commanding. The words cut through the tension like a sharpened blade, recounting the cruelty, the mockery, and the silent endurance that had defined her life under his hand. She revealed her observations, the careful record of his arrogance, and the growing strength he had underestimated. Every revelation was punctuated by small yet unmistakable signs of her power, reinforcing her dominance. The stepfather, unable to interrupt or resist, felt the full impact of humiliation for the first time, stripped of authority and confronted by a force he could neither dismiss nor challenge. By the end of the night, the girl's plan had succeeded. The stepfather, once a figure of unchallenged cruelty, was humbled, shaken, and powerless. The household, long complicit in silence, recognized the shift in authority. Every object, every shadow, every subtle manipulation she had orchestrated had combined to create a moment in which intelligence, patience, and hidden strength triumphed over overt brutality. The girl, though composed and quiet, had demonstrated that endurance, observation, and strategic action could overturn even the longest-standing patterns of oppression. As dawn approached, the stepfather sat in stunned silence, unable to reconcile his past arrogance with the new reality. The girl stood resolute, her presence commanding respect, her intelligence and careful preparation manifest in every measured action. The night had revealed not only the failure of cruelty but the undeniable emergence of her power. She had turned suffering into strategy, humiliation into leverage, and weakness into a force that none could ignore. In the stillness of the early morning, the household, the stepfather, and even the lingering spirits bore witness to the quiet but absolute triumph of patience, cunning, and inner strength, marking the pivotal moment when the girl claimed justice through a plan as subtle as it was unstoppable.